When the waitress slipped that photo into Jake's change, her hands were shaking so badly, she almost dropped it. The image showed a little boy in a hospital bed, tubes, monitors, a fight he was losing. Jake didn't know this child. He didn't know this desperate mother. But he recognized something in that photo. Something impossible. Something that had haunted him for 15 years. Within 48 hours, 12 bikers would stand in a hospital parking lot making a vow that would change everything. Because Jake Reaper Morrison had lost his own son to the same disease. And this time, he refused to let another child die. Before we dive into this incredible story, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city and state in the comments. Are you in Texas? California? Maybe somewhere in the heartland? I love seeing how far these stories reach. And while you're down there, if you believe people deserve second chances, if you think one act of courage can change everything, hit that subscribe button. This isn't just entertainment. This is a story about people who prove that kindness is stronger than judgment. You belong here. Now, let me tell you about the man they called Reaper. Because before we get to the photo that would shake an entire community, before the vow that would echo through hospital corridors and small-town streets, you need to understand the man at the center of it all. His name was Jake Morrison, though most people knew him by a different name entirely. They called him Reaper. 6'4", 240 pounds of muscle, leather, and road-worn experience. A scar ran from his left eyebrow down to his cheekbone, a souvenir from a bar fight 15 years back that he'd never bothered explaining. His hands were massive, knuckles scarred and tattooed with symbols only his brothers understood. When Jake walked into a room, conversation stopped, not because he demanded attention, but because his presence simply commanded it. The cut he wore, that leather vest covered in patches, told a story all its own. President, Blackstone Riders Motorcycle Club. 25 years he'd been riding with them. 25 years of brotherhood, loyalty, and a code that most people wouldn't understand and fewer still would respect. To some, Jake was a nightmare. The kind of man mothers warned their daughters about. The kind of face that made tourists lock their car doors at red lights. And Jake knew it. He'd learned long ago that his appearance was both a shield and a burden, protecting him from a world that judged too quickly while ensuring he'd always be judged first. But there was something about Jake's eyes that told a different story. If you looked past the intimidating exterior, past the scars and the leather and the beard that hadn't seen a barber in months, you'd see something unexpected. Kindness. Deep, ocean blue eyes that carried the weight of something profound. Something broken that had been carefully pieced back together but would never quite fit the same way again. Jake carried his grief like a second skin. Most days, he wore it so well that even his brothers didn't notice. But it was there, always there. In the way he paused before laughing. In the way he held his coffee cup with both hands, as if warming something deeper than his fingers. In the way he sometimes stared at nothing at all, lost in a place only he could visit. The Blackstone Riders weren't just a club. They were family. 12 men bound by something stronger than blood, bound by choice. Every Sunday, they gathered at the clubhouse, a converted warehouse on the edge of town that smelled like motor oil, leather, and the kind of coffee that could wake the dead. They'd argue about routes and repairs, laugh about close calls and old stories, and occasionally remind each other why they'd chosen this life in the first place. Brotherhood, loyalty, and a code of honor that Jake had written into the very foundation of the club. But there was one rule Jake lived by that even his brothers didn't fully understand. Not yet. A rule that would soon make sense in ways none of them could have predicted. See, the thing about Jake Morrison, about Reaper, was that he understood something fundamental about the world. He understood that people weren't always what they seemed. That sometimes the scariest-looking person in the room had the kindest heart. That sometimes broken people made the best healers. On any given Tuesday, you might find Jake helping Mrs. Henderson carry her groceries from her car to her third-floor apartment. 78 years old, arthritic hands, and a smile that reminded Jake of someone he used to know. She never flinched when she saw him, never clutched her purse tighter or looked away. She just handed him her bags and said, "Thank you, dear," like he was any other neighbor. And Jake? He carried those groceries like they were made of glass. That's who Jake really was. Not the nightmare that tourists feared. Not the criminal that assumptions created. Just a man who'd learned that kindness costs nothing and means everything. A man who discovered that the heaviest weights we carry aren't the ones you can see. The Blackstone Riders respected Jake not because he was the biggest or the toughest, though he was both. They respected him because he'd earned it. Because when life knocked them down, Jake picked them up. Because when the world judged them, Jake saw them. And soon, very soon, that same compassion would be tested in ways Jake never imagined. Because grief has a strange way of finding itself. And sometimes, redemption arrives in the most unexpected package. Sometimes it arrives in a photograph, slipped across a diner counter by a trembling hand. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. If you believe people are more than their appearance, hit that subscribe button. Judgmental trolls won't make it past the next scene. Her name was Nina Hartley, and she was drowning. Not in water. In bills. In desperation. In the kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones and makes every step feel like you're walking through wet cement. 29 years old, but she looked older. The kind of older that comes from working double shifts at Mel's Diner on Route 9, from sleeping 4 hours a night, from carrying a weight that would crush most people. Dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. Hair pulled back in a ponytail that had seen better days. Hands that trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking. Nina was a single mother. Had been for 3 years, ever since Tommy's father decided that fatherhood wasn't for him and disappeared into a new life 2 states away. New wife, new family, new everything, as if his first son had never existed at all. And Tommy? 8 years old, bright eyes, infectious laugh, the kind of kid who made friends with everyone, who saw the good in people before he saw anything else. He loved dinosaurs and superhero movies and drawing pictures of motorcycles he'd seen roaring past the diner windows. He also had acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The diagnosis had come 6 months ago. 6 months that felt like 6 years. 6 months of watching her baby boy lose his hair, lose his energy, lose the light in his eyes one chemotherapy session at a time. 6 months of medical bills that arrived like clockwork, each one more devastating than the last. $47,000. That's what the hospital said Tommy's treatment would cost after insurance. $47,000 that Nina didn't have, couldn't have, would never have, working double shifts, slinging coffee and pie to truckers and travelers passing through their small town. The insurance company had denied coverage for the experimental treatment Tommy needed. Denied. Such a small word for such a catastrophic decision. The letter sat on her kitchen table, surrounded by other bills she couldn't pay, next to a photograph of Tommy before he got sick. Healthy, happy, whole. Every night, Nina came home to that table. Every night, she stared at those numbers. Every night, she did math that never added up. How many shifts would it take? How many years? And the answer was always the same. Too many. Too long. More time than Tommy had. Desperation does strange things to people. It makes them consider options they'd never otherwise entertain. It makes them take risks that seem insane in the light of day, but feel like the only choice when you're standing in the darkness. That's where Nina was. Standing in the darkness, searching for any sliver of light. And then Jake Morrison walked into Mel's Diner on a Tuesday night at 9:15. Nina had seen him before. Everyone in town knew the Blackstone Riders. Knew their motorcycles, knew their reputation, knew to give them space and respect. But Nina had also heard things. Whispers about Jake specifically. About how he helped people. About how despite his appearance, despite the leather and the scars, he had a heart bigger than most. She'd also heard something else. Something a friend of a friend had mentioned in passing weeks ago. Something about Jake knowing people. About him being connected to resources. About him possibly being able to help in situations where traditional channels had failed. Nina had gotten it wrong. Mixed up the details. Confused Jake with someone else entirely. But she didn't know that. Not yet. All she knew was that her son was dying, that the system had failed them, and that this terrifying man sitting in booth 7 might be her last chance. Her hand shook as she poured his coffee. Shook as she took his order. Shook as she calculated whether she had the courage to do what she was considering. Remember that rule of Jake's? It was about to be tested. When Jake paid his bill, Nina made her decision. She reached into her apron pocket, pulled out the photograph she'd been carrying for 2 weeks, and slipped it in with his change. Her hand was shaking so badly, she almost dropped it right there on the counter. The photo showed Tommy. Hospital bed. Tubes running from his small arms. Medical equipment surrounding him like a mechanical forest. And his eyes, those bright, trusting eyes, staring directly at the camera as if asking a question no 8-year-old should have to ask. Nina turned away before Jake could look up. Before he could ask questions. Before her courage could fail her completely. She walked toward the kitchen, tears burning in her eyes. Tears she wouldn't let fall. Not here. Not now. What she didn't know? Jake would recognize something in that picture. Something impossible. Something that would tear open a wound 15 years in the making and change the course of multiple lives forever. Jake sat in his truck in the diner parking lot, engine off, overhead light on, staring at the photograph in his hand. At first, he didn't understand. A random kid's picture slipped into his change? Was this some kind of mistake? A plea for help? A test? His mind ran through possibilities, each one more confusing than the last. And then he really looked at the photo. The boy's face. Those eyes. The way his small hand rested on the hospital bed railing. The tilt of his head, even weakened by illness. The shape of his smile, brave despite the tubes and the machines and the reality of what was happening to his small body. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Because he'd seen this face before. Not this exact face. But close enough. Similar enough. Painfully, impossibly similar enough. 15 years ago, Jake had sat in a different parking lot, outside a different hospital, holding a different photograph of a different boy. His boy. His son. Michael. Michael Morrison had been 7 years old when acute lymphoblastic leukemia took him. 7 years of baseball games and bedtime stories and daddy-daughter wait. No, daddy-son adventures that Jake thought would last forever. 7 years that ended in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and death and shattered dreams. The memories came flooding back, uninvited and unstoppable. Michael's laugh, the way it filled entire rooms and made everyone smile whether they wanted to or not. The way he'd run to Jake after school, backpack bouncing, talking a mile a minute about his day. The way he'd fallen asleep on Jake's chest during motorcycle rides, tiny helmet tilted, completely trusting that his dad would keep him safe. And then the other memories. The ones Jake had spent 15 years trying to bury. Michael in a hospital bed, looking so small beneath white sheets. Michael losing his hair, crying because the other kids might make fun of him. Michael asking questions that no child should have to ask. Am I going to die, Daddy? Will it hurt? Will you remember me? Some wounds don't close. They just scar over. And Jake's wounds had never really healed. He'd just learned to function around them, to build his life in the spaces where the pain wasn't quite as sharp. He'd thrown himself into the club after Michael died. Rode harder, worked longer, helped more people. Anything to fill the void his son had left behind. The Blackstone Riders became his family because his real family had imploded. Michael's mother, Jake's ex-wife, had blamed him. Blamed him for not catching it sooner. Blamed him for not finding better doctors. Blamed him for still being alive when their son wasn't. She'd moved away 6 months after the funeral. Jake hadn't heard from her since. 15 years. 15 years of carrying that grief like a second skin. 15 years of seeing Michael's face in every child who smiled at him. 15 years of wondering what his son would look like now, what he'd be interested in, who he'd have become. And now, sitting in a diner parking lot at 9:47 on a Tuesday night, Jake was staring at a photo that might as well have been Michael all over again. The tears came before he could stop them. Silent, hot, angry tears that he'd held back for a decade and a half. His hands shook as he gripped the photograph. His chest felt like someone had reached in and squeezed his heart until it couldn't beat properly anymore. Jake didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table, the photo propped against a coffee mug, staring at this boy he didn't know. This Tommy. This child who was living Jake's nightmare. This mother who was experiencing Jake's hell. When the sun rose, Jake knew what he had to do. He walked into Mel's diner at 6:30 the next morning. Nina was there, starting her shift, and the color drained from her face the moment she saw him. She knew. She knew he'd come back. She just didn't know what that meant. Jake didn't yell, didn't make a scene. He just stood there, holding the photograph, waiting for her to come over. When she did, her hands were shaking worse than the night before. She couldn't meet his eyes. Who is he? Jake asked, his voice rough from lack of sleep. Nina's lip trembled. My son, Tommy. He's 8 and he's dying and I don't know what else to do. The words tumbled out in a desperate rush. I thought, someone told me you might. I thought you were connected to people who could help. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have. You thought I was someone else, Jake said flatly. Not a question. A statement. Nina nodded, tears spilling over. I got confused. Mixed up the information. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Her voice broke. I have no one else. No family. No resources. Insurance denied the treatment he needs, and I can't. I can't watch my baby die. I can't. She was sobbing now, right there in the middle of the diner, and Jake felt something shift inside his chest. That old, familiar anger. But not at Nina. Never at Nina. He was angry at the universe. At cancer. At insurance companies that put profits over lives. At a system that let children die because their parents couldn't afford to save them. At the cruel randomness of a world where 8-year-old boys got leukemia while other people lived long, healthy, meaningless lives. But Jake wasn't angry about the mistaken identity. He was angry because he saw his son's face in that photo. He was angry because this was Michael all over again, and this time, he might actually be able to do something about it. What's the treatment cost? Jake asked. Nina wiped her eyes, confused by the question. $380,000. But I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. Jake's jaw set in that stubborn way his brothers knew meant there was no changing his mind. Tell me everything. The diagnosis. The timeline. The hospital. Everything. Nina stared at him like he'd just offered her the moon. Why? You don't even know us. Jake looked down at the photo again. At Tommy's face. At Michael's ghost staring back at him through a stranger's eyes. Yeah, I do, he said quietly. I know you better than you think. Remember that rule of Jake's? The one his brothers didn't understand? It was simple, really. Never turn your back on a child in need. Never. No matter what. Because Jake had been powerless to save his own son. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to be powerless this time. That night, Jake made a phone call. Then another. Then another. 12 riders would get the message before sunrise. 12 men who'd sworn brotherhood to Jake and to each other. But what Jake asked them to do, it broke every club rule in the book. Because this wasn't club business. This wasn't brotherhood protecting its own. This was one grieving father asking 11 other men to help him save a stranger's child. The vow was coming. But first, they needed to know the truth about Tommy. The truth that would change everything. The truth that would transform 12 bikers into something the town had never seen before. If you believe every child deserves a fighting chance, drop a comment saying, "Fight for Tommy." Let's show Nina she's not alone. Because she wasn't. Not anymore. The first call Jake made was to Sledge. Real name Marcus Thompson, but nobody had called him that in 20 years. Sledge was 6'6", built like a refrigerator, and ran the best motorcycle repair shop in 3 counties. Hands the size of dinner plates, but he could adjust a carburetor with the precision of a surgeon. He answered on the second ring. Reaper, it's 3 in the morning. This better be good. Emergency meeting. Clubhouse. Noon tomorrow. Non-negotiable. There was a pause. Sledge knew Jake well enough to hear what wasn't being said. Someone hurt. Someone's dying, Jake said. A kid. 8 years old. Leukemia. And we're going to save him. Another pause, longer this time. Then, I'll be there. The second call went to Whisper. David Chun. Former Army medic. 2 tours in Afghanistan. Trauma training that had saved more lives than he could count. He'd earned his road name because he barely spoke above a murmur, but when Whisper talked, people listened. Jake knew why he kept his voice low. Grief has a way of stealing sound from your throat. Whisper had lost his daughter to brain cancer 4 years ago. She'd been 6. I'm in, Whisper said before Jake could even finish explaining. Whatever you need. I'm in. Bones was next. Leonard Price by birth, certified public accountant by trade, and the club's unofficial financial advisor. Balding, 52, wore reading glasses that made him look more like a librarian than a biker. But Bones could find money where there was none, could stretch a dollar until it screamed, and could crunch numbers faster than most people could count. 380,000. Bones repeated, his calculator already clicking in the background. That's aggressive, but doable. Maybe. I'll need to run scenarios. Run them, Jake said. We've got work to do. Preacher was the fourth call. James Sullivan. Former military chaplain, 61 years old, the oldest member of the Blackstone Riders, and arguably its moral compass. White beard, kind eyes, and a voice that could comfort the dying or command a room depending on what the moment required. He'd married 3 club members, buried 2, and counseled all of them at one point or another. A child needs help, and you're calling the Brotherhood, Preacher said. This is exactly what we're for, Jake. Exactly. One by one, Jake worked through the list. 12 members total, including himself. 12 men with different backgrounds, different stories, different reasons for wearing the patch. But all of them answered. All of them said yes. Some immediately. Some after questions. But all of them said yes. By 11:30 the next morning, the clubhouse was packed. 12 leather vests. 12 men standing in a rough circle. The smell of coffee and motor oil and brotherhood. Jake stood in the center, the photograph of Tommy in his hand. This isn't club business, Reaper. That was Throttle, the club's road captain, arms crossed. Not hostile, just stating facts. We don't know this family. This isn't protecting our own. You're right, Jake said. It's not club business. It's human business. He held up the photo so everyone could see. This is Tommy, 8 years old. Leukemia. His mother works double shifts at Mel's Diner and still can't make rent. His father walked out 3 years ago. Insurance denied the treatment that could save his life. And if we don't help, he'll be dead in 4 months. The room was silent. My son died of leukemia 15 years ago. Jake continued, his voice steady but weighted. I couldn't save him. The system failed us. The doctors tried, but it wasn't enough. And I've lived with that for 15 years. But this, he gestured at the photo. This I can do something about. This I can save. Sledge shifted his weight. Do we get to scare some insurance executives? Because I'm in. Laughter rippled through the room. Dark humor, but humor nonetheless. The tension broke slightly. I lost my daughter to cancer, Whisper said quietly. Every man in the room knew, but hearing him say it out loud carried weight. If there's a chance to save this boy, I'll do whatever it takes. 380,000 is a lot of money. Bones interjected, ever practical. We'll need fundraising, community support, time, strategy. Then we strategize, Jake said firmly. This is what we're for. Not just riding together. Not just drinking together. We're brothers. And brothers protect the innocent. Brothers stand up when nobody else will. Brothers save lives. Preacher stepped forward. Scripture says, whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. I say we vote. All in favor of helping Tommy and his mother, Jake called out. 12 hands went up. No hesitation. Not a single dissent. 12 men. One mission. United. But the club didn't know Jake's full plan. And when they found out, 3 members would nearly walk away. Because what Jake was about to ask went beyond fundraising. It went beyond charity. It went into territory that would test every bond they'd built over decades. But that revelation was still coming. For now, the brotherhood was whole. For now, they had purpose. For now, Tommy had 12 guardian angels on motorcycles. When 12 bikers on 12 motorcycles pulled into the Memorial Hospital parking lot at 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, the sound was like rolling thunder. Engines rumbling, leather creaking, boots hitting pavement in synchronized rhythm. They didn't mean to be intimidating, but 12 men in cuts, covered in patches and road dust, walking through automatic doors into a pediatric wing? That's going to turn heads. A nurse at the reception desk went pale. Her hand moved toward the phone. Security was probably already being called. Jake saw it happening, understood it, didn't blame anyone for it. This was the world they lived in. Appearance before substance. Fear before understanding. Nina was waiting for them near the elevator bay. She looked even more exhausted than she had at the diner, if that was possible. Dark circles under her eyes. Coffee-stained scrubs. Hair pulled back so tight it had to hurt. But when she saw Jake, something shifted in her expression. Relief. Hope. Terror. All 3 at once. These are friends, Nina said loudly enough for the nervous nurse to hear. They're here to visit my son. The nurse didn't look convinced, but she didn't pick up the phone either. They rode the elevator to the 4th floor in silence. 12 large men packed into a space meant for 8. The air thick with cologne, leather, and the antiseptic smell that all hospitals share. Jake's jaw was clenched so tight his teeth hurt. He knew these hallways. Different hospital, different time, same nightmare. The fluorescent lights. The beeping machines. The hushed conversations between doctors who delivered bad news for a living. Tommy's room was at the end of the corridor. Room 412. Nina paused at the door, her hand on the handle. He's weak today, she said quietly. The chemo makes him tired. But he's excited to meet you. He loves motorcycles. Always has. She pushed open the door. Tommy Hartley was small for 8 years old. The illness had stolen weight he couldn't afford to lose. His head was bald, smooth as an egg, with a few wisps of hair trying desperately to grow back. And 4 line ran into his left arm. Monitors beeped steadily, tracking vitals that Nina probably had memorized by now. But his eyes, those bright, impossibly alive eyes, lit up the moment he saw the leather vests. Whoa, Tommy breathed. Are you real bikers? Sledge grinned, a smile that transformed his intimidating face into something warm. The realist, little man. You like motorcycles? I love them. Tommy's voice was weak but enthusiastic. I draw them all the time. Want to see? He reached for a sketchbook on his bedside table, and Nina helped him hold it up. Page after page of crayon drawings. Motorcycles of every shape and size. Some with flames, some with wings. All of them filled with the imagination of a child who dreamed bigger than his circumstances. These are incredible, Bones said, leaning in to look closer. You've got real talent, kid. Jake stood at the back of the group, watching this boy who could have been Michael. Watching these hardened men soften in the presence of innocence. Watching Nina fight back tears as her son experienced something approaching joy in this sterile room of sickness and dying. And then Tommy looked directly at Jake. Are you the leader? Tommy asked. Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. My mom says you're going to help me. Tommy's small hand reached out, and without thinking, Jake crossed the room and took it. Scarred, tattooed knuckles wrapped around tiny fingers that barely had the strength to squeeze back. Tommy smiled up at him. Are you my guardian angel? The room went silent. Every man there felt the weight of that question, the innocence of it, the hope embedded in 5 simple words. Jake had heard those words before, from his son Michael, 3 days before he died, 3 days before Jake's world ended and 15 years of grief began. He couldn't speak, literally could not form words. His throat had closed, his chest had tightened, and if he tried to answer, he'd break right there in front of everyone. Preacher stepped in, his chaplain training recognizing a man on the edge. We're all here to help you fight, Tommy. That's what angels do, right? They fight for the good guys. Tommy nodded, satisfied with that answer, and turned his attention back to his drawings. Nina pulled Jake aside while the other riders entertained her son. Her voice was barely above a whisper. His father, Richard. He remarried 2 years ago. Lives in Colorado now. He hasn't visited in 8 months. Stopped calling 6 months ago. Sends a birthday card if I remind him. Her hands shook. I can't even be angry anymore. I'm too tired to be angry. What about family? Whisper asked, overhearing. His medic training made him think practically. Anyone who can help financially? Nina shook her head. My parents passed when I was 23. Richard's family sided with him in the divorce. Said I was keeping Tommy from his father, which is a lie. But she shrugged helplessly. It's just us. That's when Dr. Patel entered. Young, compassionate, carrying a tablet and the kind of exhaustion that came from delivering bad news to desperate families. She nodded to the bikers, clearly surprised by their presence, but professional enough not to comment. Mrs. Hartley, I have the insurance company's final decision. Dr. Patel's voice was gentle but firm. I'm sorry. They've denied coverage for the experimental treatment. Their position is that it's investigational and not medically necessary. She handed Nina the letter. Right there, stamped in red across the top, denied. $380,000. That's what the treatment cost. $380,000 that could save Tommy's life. $380,000 that an insurance company had decided wasn't worth spending. How long? Jake asked, his voice rough. Dr. Patel looked at him, then at Nina, asking silent permission. Nina nodded. Without the treatment? 3 months. Maybe 4 if we're lucky. With it, Dr. Patel's expression softened. 70% survival rate. Real, meaningful survival. He could live a normal life. 3 months. Maybe 4. Tommy was in the corner showing Sledge how to draw motorcycle flames, completely unaware that adults were discussing his death timeline like it was a weather forecast. But there was something about Tommy's case that didn't add up. Whisper, the club medic, saw it first. He'd been reading the medical charts on the wall, the ones that tracked Tommy's treatment history. His eyes narrowed, and he motioned Jake over. Look at this, Whisper murmured, pointing to dates. Initial symptoms appeared 14 months ago, but diagnosis didn't come until 6 months ago. That's an 8-month gap. What does that mean? Jake asked. It means someone missed it. Whisper's jaw tightened. Someone saw a sick kid and didn't dig deeper. Didn't run the right tests. By the time they caught it, the cancer had progressed further than it should have. Jake felt rage building in his chest. Not just at the insurance company. At a system that failed children at every turn. At doctors who missed diagnoses. At fathers who abandoned sick sons. At a world that let 8-year-olds die because their mothers couldn't afford to save them. If you think insurance companies should be held accountable, comment denied no more. Every comment is a voice for Tommy and kids like him. Tommy looked over at Jake again, smiled that innocent smile, and went back to his drawing. 3 months. Maybe 4. Not if Jake had anything to say about it. Not this time. The clubhouse that night looked like a war room. Maps spread across every available surface. Whiteboard covered in numbers, calculations, arrows pointing in a dozen different directions. Empty coffee cups multiplying like rabbits. 12 men hunched over tables, phones, laptops, whatever tools they had, trying to solve an impossible equation. How do you raise $380,000 in 3 months? Bones stood at the whiteboard, marker in hand, playing the role he was born for. Numbers guy? Reality check. The man who told you what was possible and what was fantasy. Okay, listen up, Bones said, tapping the board. 380 is our target. Here's what we can realistically do. He wrote as he talked, each number appearing in neat columns. Charity motorcycle ride. We get 500 riders, charge $100 registration, that's 50,000. Maybe. Poker run, another 20 if we're lucky. Car wash, bake sale, spaghetti dinner at the community center. We're talking a few thousand each. Maybe 5 to 10 total if we bust our asses. Sledge leaned back in his chair. So what's that give us? Bones did quick math. Best case scenario, pulling out all the stops, calling in every favor, working every angle we've got, 80, maybe 90,000 in 3 months. The room went quiet. That's not enough, Throttle said flatly. Not even close, Bones agreed. We'd need 2 years minimum to hit 380 through traditional fundraising. Tommy has months. Jake's fist came down on the table. Not a violent slam, but a frustrated thud that made coffee cups rattle. Not good enough. There has to be another way. That's when Whisper spoke up. He'd been quiet most of the meeting, studying Tommy's medical records that Nina had given them permission to review. His medic training meant he could read between the lines, see patterns that civilians missed. There might be, Whisper said slowly, but you're not going to like it. Every eye turned to him. Tommy's initial symptoms started 14 months ago, right? Fatigue, bruising, frequent infections. His pediatrician documented all of it, but he attributed it to normal childhood illnesses. Didn't order blood work. Didn't dig deeper. It wasn't until Tommy collapsed at school 8 months later that a different doctor ran the right tests and found the leukemia. Meaning? Preacher asked. Meaning someone screwed up, Whisper said bluntly. That 8-month delay? It let the cancer progress. Made it more aggressive. Made it harder to treat. In medical terms, that's called a misdiagnosis. In legal terms, it's malpractice. Bones whistled low. Medical malpractice lawsuits can award huge settlements. Hundreds of thousands. Sometimes millions, Whisper confirmed. More than enough to cover Tommy's treatment, and then some. The room buzzed with energy. This could be it. The answer they needed. Then Preacher, ever the voice of reason, raised his hand. How long do malpractice cases take? Months to investigate. Years to litigate, Whisper admitted. And lawyers cost money up front. Money Nina doesn't have. Plus, there's no guarantee they'd win. The energy deflated as fast as it had appeared. So we're back to fundraising, Throttle muttered. No, Jake said firmly. We do both. We pursue the legal angle for the long term, for justice, for making sure this never happens to another family. But for the short term, we fundraise. Hard. Fast. Loud. How loud? Sledge asked. Jake's expression was determined. Loud enough that this town can't ignore us. Loud enough that the news picks it up. Loud enough that people 3 counties over know Tommy's name and want to help. We do it all. Every idea, every event, every connection we've got. And we do it now. Over the next 2 weeks, the Blackstone Riders became a fundraising machine. And not everything went according to plan. The first car wash was a disaster. Turns out when a man covered in prison tattoos approaches your vehicle with a sponge, some people panic. 3 customers peeled out before their cars were even wet. Sledge's intimidating presence, usually an asset, scared off more donors than it attracted. They raised $300. Cost of supplies? $250. The bake sale went slightly better, but not by much. Bikers aren't exactly known for their culinary skills. Preacher's brownies were actually decent. Bones brought store-bought cookies and tried to pass them off as homemade until someone found the packaging in the trash. Whisper's attempt at cupcakes resulted in something that looked like a science experiment gone wrong. They raised $800. Progress, but nowhere near enough. The poker run attracted more riders than expected. That was the good news. The bad news? Half of them thought they were just riding for fun and didn't realize it was a fundraiser. Still, $2,300 was $2,300. Week 1 total, for $1,300. Tommy needed $380,000. The math was brutal, depressing, impossible. But the Blackstone riders weren't the only ones paying attention. Word was spreading. A local news station had picked up the story. Social media posts were getting shared. Tommy's name was becoming known beyond their small town. And in Colorado, a man named Richard Hartley was scrolling through his Facebook feed when he saw a post about his son. His dying son. His son he hadn't bothered to visit in 8 months. His son who was apparently now the center of a massive fundraising campaign involving motorcycle clubs and community support. Richard sat back in his expensive chair in his expensive house with his expensive new wife and their expensive new baby, and he started making calculations of his own. But they weren't the only ones paying attention. Tommy's father had heard about the bikers, and he was about to make a move that would threaten everything. The vow was 48 hours away. But first, they'd face their biggest obstacle yet. Not cancer, not insurance companies, not even time. Sometimes the biggest threats come from the people who should be protecting you most. Channel 7 News ran the story on a Wednesday evening. Bikers rally for dying boy, the headline read. And suddenly Tommy Hartley wasn't just Nina's problem anymore. He was the community's child. The reporter, a young woman named Jennifer Hayes, had done her homework. She interviewed Nina at the diner during her shift, showed footage of Tommy in his hospital bed, drawing his beloved motorcycles, captured the Blackstone riders planning their next fundraiser at the clubhouse. The piece was 3 minutes long, and it was perfect, heartbreaking, hopeful, and impossible to ignore. The reaction was immediate, but not universally positive. Bikers? Really? That was the sentiment echoed in coffee shops and church pews across town. Those thugs are helping a sick kid. Skepticism dripped from every word. Decades of stereotypes don't disappear because of one news story. Fear doesn't evaporate because someone does something good. But then something unexpected happened. The first major charity ride was scheduled for Saturday morning. The Blackstone riders expected maybe 100 participants. They prepared for 200 to be safe. Registration opened at 7 a.m. in the high school parking lot. By 6:30, there were 500 motorcycles already waiting. By 7:15, they stopped counting. Riders from 3 states showed up. Solo riders, couples, entire families, bikes of every make and model imaginable. Harleys and Hondas, Indians and Kawasaki's, cruisers and sport bikes, and everything in between. They came wearing different cuts, representing different clubs, but united by a single purpose. Save Tommy. The route was 50 miles through winding country roads, ending back at the high school where local businesses had donated food and drinks. Registration was $20 per bike. They raised $47,000 in a single morning. But the real surprise came from places the bikers never expected. Preacher's connection to the local church. Grace Community Fellowship resulted in the congregation dedicating an entire Sunday service to Tommy. Pastor Williams, who'd known Preacher during his chaplain days, stood at the pulpit and talked about Good Samaritans and loving your neighbor. The collection plates filled 3 times over. $15,000 in a single morning from people who'd probably never met a biker in their lives. Then the elementary school got involved. Tommy had attended Riverside Elementary before getting too sick to go. His second-grade teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, organized the students. Kids set up lemonade stands in their front yards. Hand-painted signs reading "For Tommy" decorated every corner. 25 cents a cup, but those quarters added up. The school presented a check for $8,000 at their next assembly. 8-year-olds saving an 8-year-old. If that doesn't restore your faith in humanity, nothing will. The most shocking development came from an unexpected source. The Iron Wolves, a rival motorcycle club that had butted heads with the Blackstone riders for years over territory and pride and all the stupid reasons men find to fight, showed up at the clubhouse unannounced. Their president, a man called Hammer, stood face to face with Jake in the parking lot. 20 years of tension hung between them. "We heard what you're doing," Hammer said gruffly. "For the kid." Jake waited, unsure where this was going. "We're calling a truce. Temporarily. Maybe permanently. Doesn't matter." Hammer pulled out an envelope. "This is from our club. $5,000. It's not much, but it's what we've got. No kid should die because adults can't get their act together." He handed Jake the envelope and walked away before Jake could respond. Rival clubs across the region followed suit. Old feuds forgotten. Territorial disputes shelved. All in the name of an 8-year-old boy fighting for his life. Social media exploded. Someone created a hashtag Ride for Tommy. And it spread like wildfire through local networks. Parents shared it. Teenagers shared it. Businesses shared it. Within a week, it was trending in 3 states. The local newspaper ran daily updates. The donation tracker, set up on a website Bones had quickly built, climbed steadily. 10,000, 25,000, 50,000. Each milestone celebrated, each dollar representing someone who cared. But with each passing week, there was a darker reality that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Tommy was getting weaker. The charity ride in week 3 was the biggest yet. Over 1,000 motorcycles. The sound of their engines could be heard for miles. They'd arranged for Nina to bring Tommy to the starting point, even though he could barely sit up anymore. When Tommy appeared in his wheelchair, wearing a tiny leather vest that Sledge had custom-made with honorary Blackstone rider patches, the crowd of hardened bikers erupted. Grown men with tears streaming down their weathered faces. Women clutching their hearts. The sound of 1,000 people cheering for one fragile child. Tommy smiled, weak but genuine, and waved like he was a celebrity, which, in that moment, he absolutely was. Jake knelt beside the wheelchair, his massive frame dwarfed by the humility of the moment. Tommy reached out, touched Jake's face, and whispered something only Jake could hear. Whatever it was, it made Jake close his eyes and nod. The fundraising total continued to climb. Week 4, 180,000. Week 5, 240,000. Incredible progress. Historic, even. A small town rallying around one of their own in a way that restored faith in humanity. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. They needed 380,000, and time was running out. By day 35, they'd raised $240,000. Incredible. Remarkable. But not enough. And then Jake got the phone call that would change everything. It wasn't from a donor. It wasn't from the hospital. It was from a lawyer's office in Colorado. Remember Tommy's father? He'd been watching the news coverage, watching the donation tracker climb, watching strangers care more about his son than he ever had. And he'd hired a lawyer. What he was about to do would shock even the bikers. If this community's kindness moves you, hit that like button and share this story. Let's show the world what real humanity looks like. Haters can keep scrolling, because what came next would test everything they'd built. Every dollar raised, every relationship forged, every promise made. The real battle was just beginning. The legal documents hit Jake's kitchen table like a bomb. Richard Hartley was filing for emergency custody of his son. After 8 months of silence. After 3 years of absence. After abandoning a dying child to pursue his new perfect life in Colorado. Now, suddenly, he wanted to be a father again. The motivation was transparent and disgusting. Control of the fundraising account. $240,000 and climbing. Money that Richard hadn't earned, hadn't contributed to, hadn't done a single thing to deserve. But technically, legally, as Tommy's father with parental rights still intact, he could make a claim. Nina was hysterical when she called Jake. He abandoned us. He doesn't care about Tommy. He cares about the money. Her voice cracked with terror and rage. What if he wins? What if they give him custody? What if? Jake tried to calm her, but his own fury was building like a storm. This wasn't just wrong. It was evil. Pure, calculated evil. Richard's lawyer was sophisticated. Expensive suit, polished arguments. The kind of legal predator who made a career out of finding loopholes and exploiting grief. The court hearing was scheduled for the following week. And here was the legal bombshell that made everyone's blood run cold. Richard had never terminated his parental rights. Despite the abandonment, despite the neglect, despite everything, legally, he was still Tommy's father. And the judge could freeze the fundraising account pending the custody determination. Freeze it. Lock it. Make it inaccessible while lawyers argued, and Tommy's clock kept ticking toward zero. When Jake told the club, the reaction was instantaneous and volcanic. 12 men stood in the clubhouse, faces red with rage, voices overlapping in furious disbelief. Who does this to their own kid? Sledge roared, his massive fists clenched. A monster, Whisper said quietly, though his eyes burned with intensity. Throttle paced like a caged animal. We can't let this happen. We can't. That's when Jake revealed something he'd never told the club. Something he'd kept buried for 15 years alongside his son. My ex-wife kept me from Michael's bedside. Jake's voice was hollow, distant. The last week of his life, she got a restraining order. Said I was too emotional, too unstable, that I'd upset him. The judge sided with her. I never got to say goodbye. Never got to hold his hand one last time. Never got to tell him I loved him before he died. The clubhouse went silent. None of them had known. Jake had carried that wound alone, hidden beneath layers of leather and grief and carefully constructed strength. I won't let this happen again, Jake said, his voice breaking. I won't let another father steal precious time. I won't let greed destroy what's left of that boy's life. But Richard made one critical mistake. He underestimated who he was dealing with. And when Bones started digging into Richard's finances, what he found would blow this case wide open. The vow was 24 hours away. But first, they had to win a war. And Jake was about to break his most sacred rule. Later that night, Jake stood alone in the cemetery. Michael's grave. 15 years of grass and weather and guilt. I'm sorry I couldn't save you, son, Jake whispered to the headstone. But I can save him. Bones didn't sleep for 3 days. While Richard Hartley sat in his comfortable Colorado home planning his legal strategy, Bones sat in front of 3 computer screens running searches that would make a private investigator jealous. Bank records, property records, social media archives, court filings. Every digital breadcrumb Richard had left over the past 5 years. And what Bones found was damning. Richard Hartley owned 2 properties, his primary residence worth $450,000 and a vacation condo in Aspen worth $220,000. Both purchased after he'd stopped paying child support. Both somehow hidden from Nina's attempts to collect what he legally owed. The math was simple and infuriating. Richard owed $63,000 in back child support. Money that could have helped Tommy. Money that could have paid for earlier treatments. Money that belonged to a dying child, hoarded by a man who'd rather buy vacation homes. But Bones wasn't done digging. Richard's social media was a goldmine of evidence. Photos from ski trips in Switzerland, beach vacations in the Maldives, his new wife's Instagram filled with designer handbags and champagne brunches. All of this while Tommy lay in a hospital bed, while Nina worked double shifts, while strangers donated their hard-earned money to save a child his own father had abandoned. Whisper made his own discovery in Tommy's medical files. Buried in the records was an email exchange from 14 months ago. Richard had been copied on the pediatrician's notes about Tommy's symptoms. The doctor had recommended follow-up blood work. Richard had been informed. He'd acknowledged receipt. And then he'd done nothing. Hadn't called Nina. Hadn't insisted on the tests. Hadn't advocated for his son. He'd known Tommy was sick and said nothing. Nina's lawyer was a woman named Patricia Chun, no relation to Whisper, though they joked about it. She'd taken the case pro bono after seeing the news coverage, inspired by the community's response and disgusted by Richard's opportunism. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, but she had the courtroom presence of someone twice her size and the strategic mind of a chess master. When Patricia walked into that courtroom with 3 bankers' boxes of evidence, Richard's expensive lawyer visibly paled. The hearing was supposed to be a formality. Richard's lawyer had expected to argue parental rights, file motions, drag things out while the fundraising account sat frozen. What he got instead was a systematic dismantling of his client's character. Patricia presented everything. The hidden assets, the unpaid child support, the social media evidence showing luxury purchases while claiming poverty, the email proving Richard knew about Tommy's symptoms and stayed silent. And then she brought in witnesses. Mrs. Rodriguez, Tommy's teacher. She testified about Nina's devotion, about the days she'd come to school straight from a night shift to volunteer, about Richard never once showing up for a parent-teacher conference. Pastor Williams from Grace Community Fellowship. He testified about Nina's character, her struggle, her unwavering commitment to her son. And then Patricia did something brilliant. She asked the judge's permission to show video footage from the charity ride. Tommy in his wheelchair, surrounded by bikers, smiling despite his illness. The community coming together. Strangers donating money they could barely afford. All because of Nina's determination to save her son. The Blackstone riders sat in the back row of the courtroom. Silent, arms crossed. 12 men in leather vests radiating protective energy. They didn't say a word. Didn't have to. Their presence alone spoke volumes about who stood with Nina and who stood alone. Richard sat at the defendant's table, his smugness evaporating with each piece of evidence. His new wife wasn't there. Hadn't even bothered to come. His character witnesses, people who were supposed to vouch for his parenting, suddenly had scheduling conflicts or couldn't be reached. Judge Margaret Thornton had been on the bench for 23 years. She'd seen every kind of custody case imaginable, but the look on her face as she reviewed the evidence was one of visible disgust. "Mr. Hartley," Judge Thornton said, her voice cold and precise, "you abandoned your son. You failed to provide court-ordered support. You ignored medical warnings. And now, when strangers have raised money to save your child's life, you attempt to seize control of those funds. This court finds your petition not only without merit, but morally reprehensible." Her gavel came down with the finality of justice served. Custody remains with the mother. The fundraising account remains under Nina Hartley's control to be used solely for Tommy's medical care. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney for investigation of child support violations. We're adjourned. Nina collapsed in her chair, sobbing, not from sadness this time, but from relief so profound it emptied her out. Patricia hugged her while the bikers stood and applauded, a sound that filled the courtroom like thunder. Richard stormed out, his lawyers scrambling after him, and made one final desperate play. He gave an interview to a local news station, claiming he was being intimidated by a dangerous biker gang and that the judge had been influenced by their presence. The interview aired that evening. Tommy watched it from his hospital bed. When the reporter asked Richard about his son's condition, Richard fumbled, unable to even say what type of cancer Tommy had. Tommy turned to his mother. "That man doesn't know me," he said simply. Then he smiled. "But Jake does." Richard thought he could manipulate the system. He forgot that the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when 12 investigators on motorcycles are looking for it. The vow was 6 hours away. But what happened next? No one saw coming. If you believe deadbeat parents should be held accountable, comment "Justice for Tommy." Every comment is another voice for vulnerable kids everywhere. Justice had been served, but the real miracle was still ahead. The courtroom victory was just the beginning. Within 24 hours of Judge Thornton's ruling, the story exploded beyond their small town. National news outlets picked it up. CNN ran a segment. Good Morning America featured Nina and Tommy. The story had everything media loves: underdogs, villains, heroes on motorcycles, and a child fighting for his life. But it was social media that changed everything. A pop singer with 12 million followers shared the story. Then an actor, then a professional athlete. Each share rippled outward, carrying Tommy's name and face to people who'd never heard of their town, who'd never met a biker, who just saw a child who needed help. The hashtag Ride for Tommy went from local trend to national phenomenon in 72 hours. The donation website crashed twice from traffic. Bones worked around the clock to keep it running, watching in disbelief as the numbers climbed faster than he could refresh the page. $5,000 in an hour, $10,000 in the next, $20,000 by morning. And then came the donation that stopped everyone cold. Anonymous donor, $100,000. A single contribution that represented more than all their early fundraising efforts combined. Jake stared at the notification, convinced it was a mistake. But the money cleared. It was real. Someone, somewhere, had decided that Tommy's life was worth 6 figures. The truth came out 3 days later. The anonymous donor wasn't a single person. It was a coalition of motorcycle club presidents from across the country. Rival clubs, allied clubs, clubs that had never spoken to each other. They'd quietly pooled resources, each contributing what they could, united by the unspoken code that transcends patches and territory: protect the innocent. The Iron Wolves' contribution was part of it. But so were the Devil's Disciples from Michigan, the Road Knights from Texas, the Thunder Bay Riders from Oregon. Clubs from 37 states, sending money with a single message: save the kid. By day 42, the fundraising total hit $420,000. They'd exceeded the goal, not by a little, by $40,000. Enough for Tommy's treatment, enough for follow-up care, enough for Nina to take time off work, enough to ensure that money would never again be the barrier between her son and survival. Dr. Patel called with news that made Nina drop the phone. The specialized treatment facility in Boston had an opening. Tommy could start in 2 days. 2 days. The timeline that had felt impossible was suddenly, miraculously, real. The town organized a send-off celebration in the square. Hundreds of people showed up. Families who'd donated. Business owners who'd helped. Children who'd run lemonade stands. And of course, the Blackstone Riders, standing together as they had from the beginning. Tommy was wheeled to a small stage, weak but determined. Nina held the microphone to his face because he didn't have the strength to hold it himself. "Thank you," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper but amplified for everyone to hear. "Thank you for being my angels." The crowd erupted. Grown men crying openly, women clutching their hearts, children waving signs they'd made. It was the kind of moment that restores faith in humanity, that proves kindness isn't dead, that shows what's possible when people choose love over indifference. Later, away from the crowds, Jake visited Tommy's hospital room one last time before the transfer to Boston. He pulled something from his pocket. A keychain, worn leather, faded with age, attached to a small metal motorcycle. It had belonged to Michael. Jake had carried it every day for 15 years, a talisman of grief and remembrance. "This was my son's," Jake said, placing it in Tommy's small hand. "He loved motorcycles too, and he'd want you to have it. For luck." Tommy's fingers closed around it. "What was his name?" "Michael. I'll take good care of it," Tommy promised. "And when I get better, I'll give it back so you can remember him." Jake's throat tightened. "You keep it, buddy. Michael would have liked you." Then Tommy reached under his pillow and pulled out a folded piece of paper. One of his drawings. He handed it to Jake. The image showed a little boy with angel wings riding a motorcycle through clouds. At the bottom, in crayon, "For Jake. Thank you for saving me." That's when Jake did something his club brothers had never seen in 25 years of riding together. He wept. Openly. Unashamedly. 15 years of grief, guilt, and pain pouring out in tears that wouldn't stop. Tommy hugged him. This dying child, this fragile 8-year-old, comforting a 240-pound biker who'd finally found the redemption he'd been searching for. The weight Jake had carried since Michael's death, the crushing, suffocating weight of failure and loss, finally began to lift. But the club hadn't made their vow yet. Jake had insisted on waiting for this moment. The moment when hope was real, when salvation was guaranteed, when they knew, without doubt, that Tommy would live. Now it was time. The hospital parking lot was empty except for 12 motorcycles arranged in a perfect circle. It was 11 p.m., the night before Tommy would leave for Boston. The air was cool, carrying the first hint of autumn. Overhead, stars scattered across a clear sky like witnesses to what was about to happen. 12 men stood in the center of that circle, leather vests creaking in the silence. Faces illuminated by a single camping lantern placed at their feet, casting shadows that made them look larger than life. No one spoke. They were waiting. Jake stepped forward. "Brothers," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I've never told you about Michael." The name hung in the air. Some of them had heard whispers over the years, fragments of a story Jake never fully told. But now, standing in this sacred circle, Jake was ready to speak the truth he'd buried for 15 years. "My son died when he was 7 years old. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Same as Tommy." Jake's hands trembled slightly. "I couldn't save him. I tried everything. Every doctor, every treatment, every prayer. But it wasn't enough. And when he died, a part of me died with him." The men listened in absolute silence. Even the night seemed to hold its breath. "My ex-wife blamed me. Got a restraining order the last week of his life. Said I was too emotional, that I'd upset him. I never got to say goodbye. Never got to hold his hand one last time. Never got to tell him I loved him before he took his last breath." Jake's voice cracked. "For 15 years, I've carried that guilt, that failure, that crushing weight of not being enough." Preacher stepped closer, his weathered hand on Jake's shoulder. "But Tommy," Jake continued, tears streaming freely now. "Tommy gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. Purpose. A second chance. A way to take all that pain and grief and turn it into something good. Something that matters." He looked around the circle at each man's face. "Tonight, we're not just brothers in a motorcycle club. Tonight, we become something more. Tonight, we make a vow." Sledge spoke first, his massive frame somehow gentle in the lamplight. "We vow to never let another child fight alone." Bones followed, his accountant's precision giving way to raw emotion. "We vow to be guardians for those who have none." Throttle, the road captain who'd questioned whether this was club business, spoke with conviction. "We vow to turn our pain into someone else's hope." One by one, each man added their voice to the vow, each pledge building on the last, each promise more powerful than words alone could convey. Then Whisper stepped forward, the man who barely spoke above a murmur, the man who'd lost his 6-year-old daughter to brain cancer. His voice broke as he spoke. "I couldn't save my little girl. I tried. God knows I tried. But she died in my arms, and I've carried that failure every single day since. Tears rolled down his face. But we saved Tommy, and that means everything. That means her death wasn't completely meaningless. That means I can still protect children, even if I couldn't protect her. The emotional weight of the moment threatened to crush them all. 12 hardened men, veterans of violence and loss, standing in a circle and breaking open wounds they'd spent years trying to close. Jake raised his voice, speaking the words that would bind them forever. I vow to honor Michael's memory by saving every Tommy I can find. I vow to fight for children who can't fight for themselves. I vow to turn my greatest loss into my greatest purpose. We all vow, the 11 men said in unison. This wasn't about motorcycles or brotherhood anymore. This was about salvation. For Tommy, for Michael, for themselves, for every child who would come after. Bones pulled out a folder he'd been carrying. Inside were official documents he'd prepared. Michael's Angels, he announced. The official charity arm of the Blackstone Riders. We commit to taking on one major child advocacy case per year, minimum. No child fights alone. Not while we're riding. Preacher produced 12 patches he'd commissioned from a local seamstress. Each one featured angel wings embroidered in silver thread against black leather. Below the wings, Michael's Angels. The ritual that followed was ancient and binding. Each man cut his palm, a small incision, symbolic, and clasped hands with the brother beside him. Blood mixing with blood. A physical bond to match the spiritual one. Blood oath, preacher intoned. Sealed before God and each other. They attached the angel wing patches to their vests, each one placed over the heart. A visible declaration of their purpose. Then Jake did something unexpected. He walked to the hospital entrance and gestured. A nurse wheeled Tommy outside, blanket wrapped around his thin shoulders, Nina walking beside him with permission from Dr. Patel for this brief exception. Tommy's eyes went wide seeing the circle of motorcycles, the gathered men, the solemn ceremony. Jake knelt beside the wheelchair and held out the 13th patch. Tommy Hartley, Jake said formally, you are the first and only child member of the Blackstone Riders. You taught us what true courage looks like. You reminded us why we ride. And you gave us purpose when we'd forgotten what we were fighting for. He placed the patch on Tommy's small jacket. The angel wings looked enormous on his tiny frame, but somehow perfect. Tommy touched the patch with trembling fingers, his face glowing with pride and joy. Then he looked up at the 12 men surrounding him and spoke with all the strength his failing body could muster. When I get better, I'll help other kids too. I promise. 12 grown men wept without shame. Jake looked up at the stars, at the vast universe that had taken his son and somehow led him to this moment. I hope you're proud, Michael, he whispered to the night sky. I finally got it right. For the first time in 15 years, Jake's face held something other than grief. Peace. Actual, genuine peace. The vow was made. Michael's Angels was born, and nothing would ever be the same. If you believe in second chances and the power of redemption, subscribe to this channel. Let's build a community that stands for something. Comment, I take the vow if you're with us. Show the world that kindness is stronger than judgment. Because this wasn't just a story about 12 bikers and one dying boy. This was a story about what happens when broken people decide to heal others. When grief transforms into purpose. When loss becomes legacy. The circle remained unbroken as they stood together under the stars, bound by something far stronger than leather and chrome. Bound by love. 6 months later, everything had changed. Tommy Hartley sat in a doctor's office in Boston, his mother's hand gripping his, waiting for the words they'd both been praying for. Dr. Elena Rodriguez looked up from the test results and smiled. Complete remission. 2 words. 2 impossibly beautiful words. The experimental treatment had worked. The cancer that had been stealing Tommy's life cell by cell was gone. Not dormant. Not managed. Gone. His body was rebuilding itself, gaining strength, reclaiming the childhood that leukemia had tried to steal. Tommy had gained 12 pounds. His hair was growing back, dark and curly like his mother's. The color had returned to his cheeks. The light had returned to his eyes. He was, by every medical measure, a miracle. But he wasn't the only one whose life had been transformed. Nina Hartley had a new job at the hospital where Tommy had been treated. Administrative coordinator for the pediatric oncology department. Stable hours. Good benefits. A salary that meant she could afford rent and groceries without choosing between them. Tommy's medical bills, every single one, had been covered by the fundraising money. No debt, no collection calls, no sleepless nights staring at numbers that didn't add up. And Richard? Richard Hartley had voluntarily terminated his parental rights 3 months earlier. After the court case, after the public humiliation, after his own lawyer advised him that continuing to fight would only make things worse, he'd signed the papers. Tommy would never have to see him again. Nina would never have to fight him again. That chapter was finally, mercifully closed. But the most profound transformation belonged to Jake Morrison. For 15 years, Jake had carried Michael's death like a stone tied around his neck, dragging him deeper into grief with each passing year. But Tommy, this brave, spirited 8-year-old boy, had done something Jake never thought possible. He'd given Jake permission to live again. "I spent 15 years dying with my son," Jake said during an interview with a local paper. "Tommy taught me to live again. Taught me that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of something meaningful." Michael's Angels, the charity born in a hospital parking lot under the stars, had become something far bigger than any of them imagined. In 6 months, they'd helped 7 more children. 7 families facing impossible medical bills and dying children. 7 times they'd rallied the community, raised funds, and fought alongside parents who'd run out of options. A 5-year-old girl in Vermont with a rare genetic disorder. A 12-year-old boy in Ohio needing a heart transplant. Twin sisters in Pennsylvania fighting childhood diabetes. Each story different. Each battle unique. But each one ending with hope instead of despair. The charity had raised $2.1 million total. Partnerships had formed with 3 major hospitals who now referred families to Michael's Angels when traditional funding failed. The organization had expanded beyond their small town, beyond their state, into 4 surrounding states with chapters forming in each. Nina had become a board member, her experience as both recipient and advocate making her invaluable. The waitress whose trembling hands had slipped a photo into a biker's change now sat in meetings with hospital administrators and insurance executives, fighting for policies that put children before profits. Mel's Diner, where this entire story began, had been renamed. The owner, moved by everything that had happened, had changed the sign above the door. It now read, "Michael's Place." Inside, donation jars sat on every table. Photos of Tommy, Michael, and the 7 other children helped by the charity covered the walls. It had become an unofficial fundraising hub, a place where the community gathered not just for coffee and pie, but for purpose. And Tommy? Tommy was learning to ride. Not a full-sized motorcycle, of course. He was still 9 years old and barely weighed 70 pounds. But Jake had found a small dirt bike with training wheels, and every Saturday afternoon, weather permitting, they went to an empty field on the edge of town. Jake rode slowly beside him on his massive Harley, close enough to catch Tommy if he wobbled, far enough to let him feel the freedom of 2 wheels and an open road. Tommy's laughter, pure and unfiltered and alive, was the most beautiful sound Jake had ever heard. The annual Ride for Angels event was scheduled for the following month. 10,000 riders were expected from across the country. What had started as a desperate attempt to save one child had become a movement. The angel wing patch was now a nationally recognized symbol. When people saw it on a biker's vest, they didn't see a threat. They saw a guardian. Every year on Michael's birthday, Jake visited the cemetery. But the visits felt different now. Less like drowning in grief, more like honoring a memory. He'd placed one of the angel wing patches on Michael's headstone, secured it there permanently. Fresh flowers surrounded it, left by people Jake had never met who'd heard the story and wanted to pay respects to the boy who'd inspired it all. "I hope you're proud, son," Jake whispered during his last visit. "I'm finally doing what you would have wanted. I'm helping kids. I'm making a difference. I'm living." The drawing Tommy had made, the little boy with angel wings riding a motorcycle through clouds, hung framed in the clubhouse. Every member who walked past it was reminded of why they wore the patch, why they rode, why they'd made the vow. One photo, one moment of courage, one act of kindness from a desperate mother with trembling hands. It had changed everything. Changed 12 bikers into guardians. Changed a small town's perception of what family means. Changed a grieving father into someone who could save others even though he couldn't save his own son. Changed a dying boy into a living testament of what's possible when people choose compassion over indifference. This isn't just Tommy's story. It's not just Jake's redemption. It's about what happens when broken people decide to heal others. When grief transforms into purpose. when loss becomes legacy, when ordinary people do extraordinary things simply because someone needed help and they chose to answer. What would you do if someone handed you a photo? If a stranger's desperation landed in your hands? Would you turn away? Or would you lean in? The Blackstone riders chose to lean in. And in doing so, they discovered that saving others is often how we save ourselves. Tommy rides now. Nina breathes easier. Jake sleeps peacefully. Michael's memory lives on in every child helped, every family saved, every life transformed by a vow made under the stars by 12 men who prove that angels don't always have halos. Sometimes they have motorcycles. If you believe one person can make a difference, subscribe and share this video. Drop a comment with Ride for Angels to show your support. Let's prove that kindness isn't just a story, it's a movement. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Now go be someone's guardian angel. Because the world needs more people who see a photo of a dying child and don't look away, who see injustice and fight back, who see suffering and offer hope. The world needs more people like Jake Morrison, like Nina Hartley, like 12 bikers who made a vow and kept it. The world needs more angels on motorcycles. Ride on.